Thank you for being here. And as always, the last session is also a special treat, and I'm very, very happy and proud we have Yuko Yasunaga here, who's a managing director of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization located here in Vienna. He has a long and distinguished career in between UNIDO and his home country, Japan. He is the Director General Special Representative for Asia. He was the head, before his current position, of UNIDO's Investment and Technology Development Office. And Dr. Yasunaga, prior to working for UNIDO, was Vice President of Japan's National Institute of Advanced Industrial Science and Technology, and served as Deputy Director General for Industrial Science and Technology at Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. So we're very, very happy to have him here as a distinguished speaker. I noticed already when writing to his office that I think the international economic law community does not know enough about UNIDO, so this is a great opportunity for us to learn more. He agreed also to a Q&A session afterwards. Thank you very much, Dr. Yasunaga, for coming. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ari, for your kind invitation, the kind introduction. And I want to express my sincere gratitude to all the people who contributed to materialize this distinguished course. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Yuko Yasunaga, as introduced. I'm working for UNIDO. UNIDO stands for United Nations Industrial Development Organization. How many of you know well about UNIDO? Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your honest response. Anyway, the UNIDO is responsible for SDG 9, Industry, Innovation, and Infrastructure. The industrial development is at the core of UNIDO's work and UNIDO's mandate. Our work aims to make industrial development fair and sustainable, especially in developing and emerging countries. More simply, our philosophy is as follows. People need job. Job creation is only possible through industrial development. UNIDO has to make every effort to support those countries, developing and emerging countries, for their industrial development. This is the argument that we did mostly 60 years ago. So maybe this argument is a bit too naive in the context of today's situation, but we believe industrial development can lead to a sustainable economic development. Yes, if we look back at the history of the UNIDO, we started from the following arguments. Why are developing countries still poor, still suffer? It's because they have to export their primary products without value addition. If so, we need to support those countries to develop their own industries. So it's the basic argument and basic philosophy of UNIDO. So that it is not only embedded, rather DNA, UNIDO is a specialized agency for promoting inclusive and sustainable industrial development, what we call ISID, and our current motto is progress by innovation. Industrialization that has been central to poverty eradication in developed and newly developing economies. Acquiring the capacity to produce a widening array of goods and services is essential for countries to be resilient and economically independent. Industrial production and trade as global supply chains are vital for trade and job creation. However, in the process of industrial development in high, low, and middle-income countries alike, we need to protect people's social and environmental rights, while also offering our member countries preparedness for economic independence. For more than others, people in developing and emerging economies feel the inequality of global industrial development. It is very serious. To counteract inequalities in global supply chains, businesses need to be accountable for their corporate social responsibilities in a wider sense than it is commonly regarded today. That's why one of our strategic priorities at UNIDO is to develop sustainable supply chains and ensure that producers in developing economies get a fair deal and scarce resources are preserved for future generations' welfare. Despite our efforts and the great accomplishments over the decades, it cannot be neglected that for many people in developing and emerging economies, globalization and industrial development has also led to growing inequality. Despite all the benefits of job creation, many workers suffer from unsafe and unhealthy working conditions, low wages and long hours. This must change. For example, please imagine, I have experiences of visiting Ethiopia. Ethiopia shoes factory are based on the investment from overseas. The workers he worked in a very small and closed rooms for the painting the shoes. For painting, they must use the organic solvent. Organic solvent is very crucial for their health. So we saw many such kind of examples, so that this situation must be changed. While UNIDO cannot change all of this itself, unfortunately, we are determined to do our best jointly with other international organizations, governmental or non-governmental organizations, but especially with the private sector, private companies. We know that the industry's compliance to human rights and corporate social responsibility comes at a cost. It costs. Whether it is through the certification of the need for capacity building, among others, UNIDO's role is to assist lowest tier suppliers to drive economic development while also doing it in a fair and sustainable manner, without the danger of losing connection to global supply chains. But how can we do that? For example, in Morocco, UNIDO is assisting the country's automotive sector to comply with the European Supply Chain Act, namely the German Supply Chain Act, the Lieferkettengesetz. I'm very sorry, so I do not speak any German. We do this by deploying a rapid scan tool which identifies the current gaps of the sector to comply with the law and brings together all relevant stakeholders to formulate an action plan towards closing these gaps. The funding for this intervention comes from the government of Germany. Another example is related to modeling the unintended impacts of sustainability supply chain regulations, which becomes very popular, especially in European countries. As we know, several European countries introduced the human rights and environmental due diligence regulations, also in Japan. An important question is how these regulations will affect companies, suppliers, and the pattern of international trade. In order to anticipate the potential effects, it is essential to model them. UNIDO has conducted a synthesis of the methods available to model, which are potentially leading to unintended consequences of regulation, and will embark into a modeling exercise. UNIDO is in a discussion with the UN Forum for Sustainability Standards, UNFSS, for inclusion of the results of the modeling into UNFSS the 2024 flagship reports. The results will trigger a discussion on the cost and, more importantly, who should pay, to what extent this question into open the agenda for discussion among the member states. The legislations and regulations imposed by the EU and individual member states, like the supply chain regulations, have a great impact on developing and emerging countries. But as these laws are still relatively new, and we have only very little experience and knowledge about those. The next important question is how these regulations will affect local companies' behavior, or trading partner countries and suppliers. According to UNIDO's study on the unintended impacts of sustainability supply chain regulations, measuring regulatory costs is difficult due to policies' heterogeneous and complex nature. The following two impacts might be a reality soon. First, shifting the burden of compliance from buyer, from consumer, to suppliers. Although this is not permitted in the legal context, research indicated that this is happening, actually happening, and SMEs, small and medium enterprises, in producer countries report additional burden on compliance reporting. Even if those are unintentional, this might increase inequality and have a negative impact on developing and emerging economies as they can less likely afford the additional bureaucracy. Second, the change will be exclusion from business relations or business opportunities. The research shows the likelihood of switching suppliers is higher in cases where substitution is easier, particularly for suppliers producing homogeneous products or operating informally. Switching is less likely, of course, in case of customized or high value added parts and components. UNIDO, through its global program on sustainable supply chains, addresses these possible impacts by first increasing awareness of the new regulations, especially in producer countries, and second, assisting small and medium enterprises in producer countries to comply with global supply chain regulations through capacity building and knowledge transfer. Even though in developed countries like Europe, like in Japan, like Korea, the SMEs, small and medium enterprises, is relatively in the disadvantaged position. In Japan, you may know or you may not know, everyone knows Toyota, Panasonic, Hitachi, but most of the components are manufactured by first tier, second tier, third tier suppliers. Most of them are SMEs. SMEs are really making efforts to make excellent goods from European countries and Japan, Korea. So that the SME policies not only assisting, but also the providing the good opportunities to them or good knowledge to them is very crucial industrial policy. One of the pillar industrial policy of even in the developed countries. One of the major issues of the EU's supply chain regulations is a lack of representation of producer countries, mainly the developing and emerging countries, in the discussion around the regulations, sometimes unintended impact on them. Industry stakeholders in developing and emerging countries often lack awareness of global supply chain regulations and related regulations at planning stage. They risk countries being excluded from global and regional value chains and losing critical access to the global market. Inclusive consultation would be the key to ensure a successful, fair, and inclusive implementation of regulations. In the case of Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, what we call CSDDD, the EU Commission conducted a public consultation in a preparation phase. The proportion of industrialization producer countries' responses were marginal and almost meaningless in comparison to industrialized consumer countries' responses. The voices of the industrializing the producer countries are not yet heard loudly enough, even though their development is affected to a large extent. Making their voice heard or visible is a role and the responsibility of UN organizations such as UNIDO. UNIDO has 172 member states. Unfortunately, United States, UK, France, Belgium, those are not members of UNIDO. Very unfortunately. UNIDO's 172 member states adopted a resolution during our 20th General Conference in last November, which requests UNIDO to foster an inclusive process that makes all voices heard to create productive, resilient, and sustainable supply chains globally and regionally. If properly supported, especially young people in developing producer countries are a potent force for driving inclusive economic growth and addressing some of the most pressing socio-economic inequalities. UNIDO recognizes that creating quality jobs and realizing the demographic dividend are particularly important for the political, social, and economic stability of many developing and emerging countries. The creation of decent jobs and a skilled workforce can only be achieved by the joint and concerted efforts made by private and public sector. We need to blend private and public engagements to support equal and inclusive access to economic development. UNIDO manages a learning and knowledge development facility, what we call LKDF, which is a platform that promotes industrial development among youth in industrializing economies. The LKDF's mission is to address the mismatch between the skills available in a country and the skills needed by labor markets, and not only today's labor market, but also for the tomorrow's labor market. For many developing countries, access to quality educational system and the training program is not adequate to meet new demands and address technological, social, and environmental challenges. For example, I remember nearly 80 years ago, just after the Second World War, Japan was very poor. The most of all the important industrial infrastructure was completely destroyed. But frankly speaking, our education was very good. After the Meiji Restoration, which took place in the end of 19th century. After that, Japan imported the excellent educational system from European countries and created a unique educational system, especially in the elementary education phase. So that our pride, or the pride of Japanese people just after the Second World War was, we were educated. And as you may know, you may not know, average Japanese knows more than 2,000 Chinese characters. 2,000 of Chinese characters. Of course, it is also a very high barrier for average Japanese to learn foreign language, especially the European languages. But we can communicate with, for example, the Chinese people without saying nothing by writing Chinese characters. And we were educated the mathematics very well, so that for example, I remember that when I entered the U.S. graduate school in Vienna economics, because I had an engineering background, most of the students from Japan to study the graduate school in United States, even in literature class, took the 100% full mark of mathematics exam. So that we know that education is quite important for economic development. I know that many of or some of Asian middle-income countries are suffering from so-called middle-income countries trap. They have been enjoying the high economic growth, but after reaching the medium-income countries, their growth rate is stagnant, became stagnant. So that the education, technology, the knowledge is quite important for the countries' economic development. UNIDO, of course, recognize that. Anyway, so that the UNIDO identifies and collaborates with public, private, and development partners to develop and scale up the technical and vocational education training system, what we call TVET, Technical and Vocational Education Training, to address the skill gap in developing countries. Our training and innovative curricula equip young female and male students with demand-driven skills and future skills to seize the opportunities of the technological progress. The mentioned UNIDO initiatives, among many others, aim to close the inequalities in developing and emerging countries, the economic development. But the inequalities in these countries are facing in their economic development are unfortunately, by far the only inequalities that they have to overcome. Developing countries are disproportionately affected by the consequences of climate change, even though they have hardly contributed to the global greenhouse gas emissions. For example, the African continent only contributed around 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If we were to exclude South Africa, Republic of South Africa, this number would even fall to 1%, only 1%. Despite only having a small role in causing climate change, the African continent is amongst those most affected by it. Because more than 60% of the African countries, the population, are engaged in agriculture. And agriculture is the industrial sector most affected by climate change. The effects of climate negative negatively impact the social and economic development of the developing and emerging countries. These countries need to be supported to achieve less carbon-intensive industrialization than developed countries did. UNIDO works on boosting the demand for low-carbon industrial material with the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative. It can also not be neglected that industrialization comes with a high demand of energy. Notably, some developing countries still fail to provide grid access to 60% of its population. According to the World Bank research, I remember that in the world, 29 countries worldwide, people do not have an access to electricity. And 27 among 29 are located in sub-Saharan Africa. So it is too serious. So in various projects, UNIDO supports developing countries in providing sustainable energy for all and in decarbonizing the country's energy systems, like the demonstration project in African countries for solar energy, wind energy, and so on, and also the geothermal energies. Nonetheless, the increasing industrialization in developing and emerging economies requires large energy inputs. UNIDO is determined to help establish a fossil fuel-free industry. In that, a special focus on green hydrogen. The green hydrogen means the hydrogen extracted from the water by electrolyzing, using the green energy, using renewable energy like the solar and the wind. Without which it is almost impossible to have the decarbonized steel, cement, or chemical industries. Frankly speaking, from my own personal point of view, because I studied the mining engineering and metallurgical engineering, the genuine carbon-free iron steel is quite difficult because iron ore is an iron oxide. The iron is made from iron oxide by removing oxygen. To remove oxygen, we need the chemical process called reduction. And for reduction, carbon is the most efficient element. So that in order to produce the virgin iron and steel, we inevitably have to use the coking coal. Of course, increasing the recycle portion of the iron, because it is said that in average, iron infrastructure like the railway, buildings, bridge, those are staying in the society in average for 60 years. So that if we successfully have affordable and reasonable method to recycle those iron steel, we can reduce the consumption of the virgin iron steel. So we need many facets of the scientific and the engineering and the societal efforts. Anyway, as you can see, inequality and development has many complex faces. Even we just talk about it in the context of SDG 9. We at the UNIDO firmly believe that we can contribute in resolving inequality in industrial development, and that most of our projects can have a multiplier effect to be replicated. UNIDO stands ready to work with the industry stakeholders and the various public sector in the government and the international organizations for supporting to form sustainable industrial policies, designing vocational training facilities and mechanisms, and good ties with the partner countries and other organizations to ensure inclusive and sustainable industrial development. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
So much, and please take your seat. And we have the opportunity to ask some questions. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, we'll start.
I think I should talk loud enough. Okay. Okay.
I think it's also for the recording and for online.
Makes sense, makes sense. Well, first off, thank you so much, Mr. Yasunaga, for that really great comprehensive explanation of UNIDO. I know definitely very helpful for me, hopefully for others in the room as well. So my question has to do with, some of the aspects you talked about in the work that UNIDO does with the capacity building and knowledge transfer, and especially as it pertains to the CSDDD or CSDDD mandate that, already European countries struggle to implement, let alone in the topic of having the knowledge to execute in developing nations. So I previously worked in human capital consulting, and so a big topic of my previous work was actually how to design the organization and make sure that the people in leadership roles knew how to execute on huge changes like this. And my partner also works in consulting, but on the sustainability side, so actually how organizations will know how to report and to actually reduce their emissions for the CSDDD mandate. So how do you see the work of UNIDO working with the partners in those developing nations to actually execute the organizational change necessary? You talked about, making sure that they have the capacity to execute the knowledge, but actually how do they, either work with the partners or provide them guidance on how to structure those organizations so that those people are in place when you leave to actually make sure that the mandate is met and to actually reduce emissions as they continue to develop? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insightful questions. It is also a big task for UNIDO and maybe for all other institutions related to human resource development and capacity building. Yes, we regard that the most important thing is to show the effect, to show the impact of capacity building or knowledge transfer or idea of sustainability in a visible term. For example, the many manufacturing industries in developing countries do not take environmental impact very seriously, unfortunately. But we look back at the Japanese history, for example, in 60 years ago, Japan was one of the most polluted, in a sense, polluted country, especially in the vicinity of the manufacturing facilities. You may remember Minamata disease. You may remember Itai disease. So that 70 years ago, Japanese government, Japan's private sectors, and Japanese society did ignore the negative effect of the environment protection or pollution. But please remember that if we can successfully reduce the pollution, it inevitably means that the efficiency of use of the raw material, the input materials, can be increased. It means it's cost down. And if we can reduce the emission to river to atmosphere, it means that the manufacturing process also becomes very efficient. In that sense, to the private sector, the company manager, hey, you can reduce the cost by changing your production process to be a cleaner process, greener process, so that if we can successfully convince them that the sustainable idea, sustainability is also good for your operations profitability, not only for people's welfare, but also your business profitability. So if we can successfully say so, they believe to do so. So, and in addition, capacity building. If your employees become knowledgeable, your the rate of the imperfect products, bad product, fall down from some percent to almost nearly to 0%. So you will become very efficient and profitable, and you can get the reliability from your users, the buyers of your products, so that the knowledge sharing, knowledge transfer becomes your operation profitable, and also for the country, your industrial structure more advanced. If they understand, they can voluntarily take their own action to they promote such kind of things. I believe so. And the UNIDO's the technical corporations are mainly based on such kind of idea. Connecting the economics and the social welfare. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Hello, thanks very much for your talk. I have a question that concerns how does UNIDO in its industrial policy making deal with conflicting sustainable development goals? For example, economic growth or prosperity versus mitigating or battling climate change. There are sometimes we would face conflicts in our interest. You mentioned electricity supply in sub-Saharan Africa. So there might be still a lot of short-term blackouts, and there's still a lot of finance going into non-renewable energy production in order to come up with these struggles. But still, we have long-run consequences on they're running against our goals to battle climate change. And renewable energy solutions would take too long or too costly to deal with the short-term consequences. So is there any differentiation between long-term and short-term policy making that UNIDO is conducting?
Thank you very much, Eddie, for your another insightful questions. Yes, it is a big questions. As you said, and we are faced with that kind of a trade-off between short-term solutions and long-term solutions. In order to suffice the energy demand for developing countries in a shorter time, it is easy to support or easy to encourage those countries to use more coal, because the coal-fired power plant is the cheapest in the establishment and operation. However, coal-fired plant is the most harmful from the context of the global warming, so that we have to, first in general, we need to design transition policy, good transition from today to say 2050, 2060, because at the 2050 many countries, unfortunately not all, but many countries are going to realize zero emission. So that we have nearly 26 years from now to then. So, of course, developed country shall make the utmost effort to realize the zero emission the economy as close as possible. However, for example, China already declared that the country will realize the zero emission by 2060. And for the case of India, 2070. And you may know that more than 30% of carbon dioxide is emitted by China. And nearly 7% is from India. So that nearly 40% are being emitted by those two countries. So we need to design good transition policy for introducing, of course, renewable energy and the hydrogen and energy efficiency measures. I know that this is quite difficult for most of the countries. But for example, even in developing countries, the many sub-Saharan countries have a good the location for the solar panels. But of course, the solar panels that can only generate electricity in daytime. So in order to use those electricity in nighttime, we need the electricity restoration devices, which is the battery. And the battery is very expensive, and it needs many different elements like lithium, cobalt, the nickel, and so on. Those are not evenly distributed in Earth crust. So that we need to tackle the many challenges at the same time. Of course, I'm not saying that for some countries using more fossil fuels is allowed. I don't say so, because by making every efforts to increase their energy efficiency, we can actually reduce or we can actually offset the increased portion of energy consumption from those developing countries. So we need a policy mix for designing the transition policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this insightful talk. Given that we are talking nowadays about the service economy, now we can talk about service industries, but when I looked at SDG 9, it focuses still a lot on a secondary economy infrastructure. How has UNIDO reinvented its mandate against this background, and maybe also in the light of the fact that many emerging economies among the developing countries may have achieved SDG 9 already? And then linking to the topic of this conference, is the work, your capacity building work, creating linkages, for example, to social and workers' rights based on the ILO conventions, for example? Are there linkages that your organization seeks in capacity building in this respect? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, yes, in UNIDO, it is true that many of us are still influenced by the manufacturing industry first kind of idea. Because many people do believe that many industrialized countries, like European countries, Japan, Korea, they have been experiencing industrialization days. In other words, the manufacturing industries lead the economy. It is true. And some or many of the, for example, African countries also believes that they need the manufacturing industries. I believe it is fair. It is fair because as I said in the beginning of my speech, the UNIDO's basic argument is that why are developing countries still poor? Because they have to export the primary products without value addition. In order to get value addition, we need to encourage manufacturing or manufacturing industries or processing industries. But please imagine that with an active use of ICT, information communication technologies, the manufacturing process, some critical part of manufacturing processes can be economized and optimized with those ICT. And in addition, we found that ICT may become faster, may become more popular even in developing and emerging countries faster than the industrialized countries. Please imagine that in Kenya, many people uses mobile money called M-Pesa. Please visit Japan. Unfortunately, Japanese people like myself do not use the e-money so often. So that the ICT can become more popular in the country where the infrastructure is not so well developed. So we call it, and many people know that this is a leapfrogging approach. For example, before popularizing the fixed telephone in Africa, the mobile phone became popular. So that using ICT, we can modernize and we can realize the more efficient types of new industry, including the manufacturing industry, including, of course, the services industries. So that connecting ICT with existing industry is a key for modernizing and the supporting developing countries' the economic development. We believe so.
If I may add one last question. Sorry, we spoke a lot about corporate sustainability and due diligence obligations.
Oh.
And we heard also over the course of the conference several times that there is pushback because a lot of developing countries, not entirely unjustifiably, sometimes regard the developed countries saying, okay, now you have to fulfill certain obligations, because in the end they are pushed off to producers in developing countries, as a form of neocolonialism. So I was wondering whether there was any pushback to UNIDO helping in this process, whether there were developing countries that said, no, we entirely reject this concept and we don't want UNIDO to work on this, or whether the view taken by the membership was very consensually, this is there, we have to deal with it, and we want UNIDO's help.
Thank you very much. It is a very pertinent question for UNIDO. The UNIDO is not in a position to just protect the developing and emerging countries, not to adapt, modernize the regulations, so that it is already admitted the flow of the trend that we need to introduce the new type of the due diligence, the new type of the regulations and so on, for safeguarding the people's welfare in the world. Having said so, partly mentioned in my presentation that it is inevitably a cost to produce in producing countries. Some people may say it's a kind of new colonialism, but we have to cope with that situation by promoting knowledge transfer to newly developing countries, and also support those countries the institutionalizing the scheme to for more smoothly so penetration or operationalization of such kind of new regulations or new rules. Of course, it is not so easy because the social background is totally different from us. It is not correct from European, from Asian, from African. So we have totally different business culture or culture system, so that it is not so easy. But we have to mitigate the impact of the introduction of the new due diligence or new regulations. But to facilitate smooth operationalization without harming their indigenous business culture. I'm saying that it is not so easy, yes.
Thank you so much. And before we go over to the final famous last words of the conference, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Yasunaga. We learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The discussion of the interrelationship between international economic law and human rights is far from new. And I think many of the people in this room have been involved for a long time. In fact, even I have been involved in this debate for longer than I care to actually admit to myself. But I think, nevertheless, the 2 days were very helpful in clarifying that there is some change. So what I will try to do in the last 5 to 10 minutes is try to present those shifting sands that we see in the global environment and the relationship between those two systems. Now, I confess to some unease doing that. Why? Because all of these shifting sand stories, all of these very neat timelines of we're moving from one to the other, clarify red lines and sometimes introduce red lines and dichotomies that are not neatly there. They simplify. They contain an element of simplification, whether it's from apology to utopia, US versus Europe, global south, BRICS, all of these are simplification stories. All of these are, at the core of it, to some extent, wrong. And I usually dislike that, but I also have to recognize that our brain works that way. To get at least an element of clarity in this total chaos that surrounds us, we need the simplification. And I leave it to you to say whether the simplification is correct or not. And I will actually end up criticizing myself just a tiny little bit, but I nevertheless will dare to do that simplification. So when we start off and look at the founding moment of our international economic law order and our international human rights order, and I'm speaking now about the 40s to 60s, so Bretton Woods, GATT 1947, the first BIT, Germany, Pakistan, 1959, the international financial order, and on the other hand, the human rights system, UDHR, by the way, there are still some copies outside, adopted by the General Assembly in 1948, European Convention 1950, ICCPR, ICESCR now in 1966, American Convention on Human Rights 1969. These systems were conceived separately. I refuse to think, and I actually am pretty sure they weren't conceived in conflict to each other, but they were regarded as largely separate things. They had their own rules, their own rationalities, and in fact the rationality of the economic system was to some extent regarded as conducive to, if not human rights in a technical sense, at least human development as a positive sense, as you can see legally from the preamble of the GATT, for example, that states, recognizing that their relation in the field of trade and economic endeavor should be conducted with a view to raising standards of living, ensuring full employment, and a large and steadily growing volume of real income and effective demand. So to some extent, the economic order was perceived as instrumental for furthering human development, but please don't regard that as don't let human rights enter. It is a separate system. I think conflict is the wrong word, but ships passing in the night captures the relationship rather decently. That, I think, we have seen in the last 2 days has changed significantly. In the past, and you can still see that in WTO dispute settlement, the segmented system was characterized by not letting norms from the human rights regime, for example, enter the WTO regime. In fact, there was one case where India argued with human rights norms that never went to dispute settlement. That was patent law being used to seize pharmaceuticals in transit, but that case was resolved before. Otherwise, there was a lot of literature on arguing that the WTO should be open for human rights norms, but there is no practice of actually applying human rights norms within the system. Investment arbitrators similarly, and we heard that still today, I think Federico called it super norms, their task was to protect the investment. That's what the system was set up for. It was not set up for human rights, if you take the exception of property to some extent, but not for human rights of the indigenous population where the investment was taking place. And the arbitrators saw their task as limited to that extent. The last 50 years have seen that change. It has seen change in all of these areas, starting, for example, with trade law. We've seen the rise of development and the argument of development and the importance of special and differential treatment in trade. That was maybe the first human rights-y norm that decidedly entered the trading system. And in the area of free trade agreement, we've seen that these days free trade agreements contain a plethora of different norms. Trade and sustainable development is now a standard element of at least EU free trade agreements. Human rights conditionality, again, is also introduced in those agreements with the possibility to withdraw trade benefits if human rights are decidedly breached. I'm not saying that this is easy or indeed that it has ever been decidedly done, but the possibility is there. And sometimes you see it introduced in debate, curiously, probably most recently in the UK-EU debate, because the UK does argue about leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, and the EU in those cases will have to stop cooperating on some of the elements of the trade and cooperation agreement with the UK. So those norms have entered the system. The same is true to some extent in investment law. We see new novel BITs with larger policy space, also introducing labor norms to some extent in, for example, the US model BIT, but also in other treaties. And we see international finance and financing of projects also introduce, as I learned today better than ever, in the order of the international financing system, most recently in the Environmental and Social Commitment Plan, the World Bank. We've heard, of course, from the European Investment Bank and the importance of human rights in their investment policy. All of this points to shifting sands from two systems that are disconnected to two systems that are now connected and try to coordinate. We are far away from systemic integration, but at least we have a form of apparent integration and apparent coordination that tries to use the economy also to achieve better human rights outcomes and tries to coordinate that economic system with human rights norms. Now, that is the storyline from disconnected systems to coordinated systems. But I'm not going to keep you with a simplified storyline. There are lots of rifts in the system. Because first of all, when I speak about trade, most of the examples mentioned come from the EU. Second, the EU itself says the gold-plated FTAs of the days of yore have run to an end. We are still negotiating some of them, but the future lies in mini deals. The EU and other actors reaching deals on very specific issues. There's a problem in beef trade, there's a problem in pork trade, let's resolve this, let's get rid of the trade barrier. Case closed. This is very problematic for the existing order, but the existing order is crumbling, and everyone seems to think about these new deals. Human rights, then again, disconnected normatively from that system. In investment law, the system seems very resilient to normative change. We've seen books saying that while sometimes treaties have actually changed their wording, arbitrators seem to ignore that. We've also seen that the creation of new treaties doesn't mean that they're actually adopted. The EU and its new concepts in investment law have a hard time actually getting those treaty adopters. Instead, we run the system on the treaties that we had all of the time. And when it comes to finance, yes, human rights have entered the system, but it is the finance organizations themselves that interpret them. And with the rise of new actors in the financial system, development banks that operate from China and India, of course, the perception that they have is that when we speak about human rights, we are trying to again condition and again impose our ideas and thoughts, and that China particularly wants to pursue a different route, a Chinese path to development, in line with China's non-interference principle for foreign policy, which, as a rule, does not condition aid on China's ideas of human rights, or definitely not our ideas of human rights. So while we are moving, while the storyline for me still is a move to a coordinated system, it is not a neat process, and it is a process that, of course, suffers from the rifts in the international rules-based system that we experience today. And when you open the newspapers every day, you get news stories about the shortcomings of the system. And of course, a normatively coordinated system is of little help when countries start to ignore all normative systems altogether and just act out of political necessity. Let's hope, though, that we can return to the coordinated normative system. Thank you all very much for being here. Thanks very much for coming. It has been a pleasure to see so many friends, so many old friends, and so many new friends. Thanks for being here, and I hope to see you again very soon.